This is the Storyworks Roundtable, conversations about craft for writers and readers curious about writers. Can you believe it is already the middle of January? Every year, it feels like the weeks just speed by faster and faster. So I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy day to listen to the Storyworks Roundtable. Catherine and I really appreciate it so much. This episode is one of our favorites, which, is tough to say because we've done over 300 of these podcasts so far. We've got a science fiction panel for you. And this conversation is far-ranging, philosophical, and fun. We go deep. These authors are thinkers as well, and we've got dystopian fiction and environmental science fiction and conspiracy theory, thriller-type science fiction. And we don't just talk about what's on the page. We also talk about how it relates to real life, the fate of humanity. And I think that's one of the things science fiction does so well for us as people. It holds up that mirror that says, hey, look at what we're doing. And what if it goes in this direction? And you'll want to stick around to the end of the episode. We've got a speed round question, and each of the authors gives us their top recommendation from the field of science fiction. Great stuff there. Now, if you've been listening to the Storyworks Roundtable for a while, you know that we go deep into story craft. And maybe you've listened to some of those episodes and thought, wow, I would love to go deeper, really explore this topic and do it not only by listening and thinking a little bit, but by doing it. Well, at a room full of books and pencils, my Substack right now, I've got a craft series of posts on writing action scenes, but it's not just about action like chases and fights. It's really about physicality, getting bodies in movement that interact with other bodies, with their setting, with the props on the page, and describing it in such a way that you don't slow down your pace, you keep your reader engaged, everything is clear and meaningful and with purpose, writing that scene to purpose. These posts are all free. You can get them at booksandpencils.substack.com. Go check it out. I've got, I think, 4 out so far, and another 1 or 2 to come to wrap up this series. And I am planning on doing more deep dives into craft over there at my Substack. These posts actually take a good deal of time and effort, so I would love to know what you think. If you check them out, leave a comment on the post, ask a question. I will definitely answer questions there. All right, thank you for listening to my announcement. And now, the science fiction panel. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Catherine and I are delighted to be joined by 4 science fiction authors. And as I like to do with group sessions at the Roundtable, I'm going to have each writer introduce him or herself so that you get to hear their name, their title, and a little bit about their writing in their own voice, just to make it easier to connect those dots right off the bat. So, Mark, welcome to the Roundtable. Why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your book?
Sure, thank you. I'm really glad to be here. My name is Mark Morton, and my most recent novel, the young adult novel, dystopian novel called The Headmasters. It's set in Northern Ontario, the Canadian Shield, and it's about memory and identity, and I guess ultimately about hope. The tagline for that novel, if I recall correctly, is how can you learn from the past if it's forbidden? And yeah, that's me.
Excellent. Kristina, how about you?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kristina Rienzi. I am an author of fiction and nonfiction. I live at the Jersey Shore. My latest science fiction novel is called Among Us. The tagline is "We Are Not Alone," and it is a new adult government conspiracy thriller, cat and mouse thriller, I call it, set on the East Coast that takes us from New Jersey to DC and back, and just explores the secrets and lies of government conspiracies.
Excellent. Brad, welcome to the round table. And you are on mute.
Rookie mistake. It's like I haven't lived through COVID.
Right.
So yeah, thank you so much for having me, Alida. My name is Brad Anderson. I do have a microphone. I am a sci-fi writer. My current book is Duatero. It's a far sci-fi future about a world that's basically dying, and an withered old hero has to try to figure out why that is. I have a new book coming out in December called Ash Me Song, but that's a whole different story. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Lance, your turn.
Thank you. I'm also very glad to be here. Looking forward to the conversation. My name is Lance Robinson. I am in Thunder Bay, Ontario, on the shores of Lake Superior. My most recent book is called Chasing New Suns. It's a collection of short stories, and I believe the tagline is 7 stories of mind, heart, and spirit.
Nice. Well, first question, why science fiction? What attracted you to that genre? Why is that the best container for the stories you want to tell? And if nobody jumps in, I'm just going to call names and pick on you. So
I'm happy to jump in.
Great.
I mean, as I'm sure is the case with all of us, I've always loved science fiction since I was a early teenager. As for why I write science fiction now, I guess specifically I write dystopian science fiction, and the reason I like dystopian science fiction, writing it and reading it, is that I find that in that kind of world, it kind of strips things away to the bare bones of character, and it allows me as an author to spend more time having characters interact, and then I have to worry less about maybe some ordinary details. I don't have to describe a Starbucks, for example, and then that kind of thing I would be awful at. So I do whatever I can to try to avoid that, and then just focus on stripping things back. So that's why I like writing my kind of science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I think of the science fiction that really got me hooked as a young reader, and that was from authors like Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke. People who could just open my mind to this grand vista of possibilities, the creating that awe and wonder. But as I got older and a little more sophisticated, I hope, I also began to see that science fiction is very good at exploring questions and issues, social and philosophical and ethical and political kinds of issues, in a way that it can do it in a way that's different than mainstream fiction. But putting things in a different time and place, a different world, disguising or putting a twist on some of the issues or questions we're facing in our world today. Science fiction allows us to see that with new lenses.
Yeah,
and
separation.
That's part of what I love reading science fiction and what I am often trying to do when I'm writing it.
Very cool.
Brad, were you starting to say something?
You go, Kristina.
I'll follow Brad.
Good thing. And actually, similar to Lance, I'll get back to what Lance was talking about in a second. But I think one of the things that originally drew me to science fiction is it's about the future, right? And it's about all the things that the future could be, the good things, the bad things. And you get to kind of explore and see how certain technologies, you get to imagine what technologies might be there and how we might get there and what life might be like. So I've always loved that. But yeah, what Lance was kind of saying at the end there also kind of resonates with me. I find in terms of writing, why do I write science fiction? Like I love reading all types of books, including science fiction. But why do I tend to write in science fiction? Because I think you can explore issues that are, you can explore issues in a way that you can't if you're writing just plain old fiction, right? If I was to write a story in the contemporary world, I think all of us come to that with baggage. Like I, as the author, come to it with baggage. All the readers come to it with baggage. We already have these preconceived ideas. And so it's tough to see things, I think, with new eyes when you write just fiction. But with science fiction, you can create a totally different world, and people come to that a little bit more open, willing to learn. And so you can explore ideas without people's baggage and biases immediately jumping on it, which I think gives a little bit more freedom to explore things than you might otherwise. So I really enjoy it for that reason. As there you go, similar to Vance there at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and I can
Kristina.
I'm sorry, I didn't say interrupt. Yeah, I can definitely piggyback on what everyone's saying, because I think when you have a love for science fiction and you have a love for writing, it really allows you to dig deep creatively. And I've always loved exploring the unknown, questioning things since I was a child. What's out there in the universe? Is there anything? What is real? What's not real? And exploring that. And certainly as a writer in fiction, you can dive into those issues. And with science fiction, I feel like you go a little further. So for me, I like to insert some fact, and I know there's fact in all of our writing as well. There's fact in fiction, but I like to really explore, okay, what do we know? What can I twist? And what can I twist to the point of being terrified? Like I want to scare myself in my writing. And I want, when people read my writing in science fiction, and I consider it a thriller, to feel that feeling. And if I'm not feeling it, my reader's not feeling it. So for me, it's about, diving into the unknown, exploring the possibilities, being open to anything, twisting a little bit of the truth, and taking it a step further to say, well, what if? And then what? And then what? And then what? And it's kind of like a game for me to just see how far I can push it and how far I can go with it still feeling like, wow, this could really be true. But it is actually fiction. Or wink, wink, is it? We don't know. But that's the fun of it all. So that's where I have a lot of fun with it, and it scares me too. So
something Kristina said. It reminded me of something I was thinking about just recently as well, about creativity in science fiction. And I think there's something that science fiction does a bit differently than the other speculative fiction genres. Is that working with facts, working with actual science, even if you put in something that's unrealistic, 1 or 2 faster than light travel or whatever, fine. But for the most part, science fiction has to work harder at plausibility and connection with actual science. We extrapolate, we look to possibilities beyond what we know, and that's fine. But we've got some boundaries around ourselves. And I remember talking to a poet one time, and he was talking about the sonnet. And when you write a sonnet, you've got 14 lines, you've got a predetermined rhythm and a predetermined rhyme structure. So you've got these really tight boundaries around yourself, and you've got to write your poem in that little compartment according to those rules. And that, he said, forces me to work harder, to find the right words, to be creative. And I think science fiction in its own way does the same thing in a way that, and I love reading fantasy and horror and other speculative fiction genres as well. But science fiction, by putting those boundaries around, for me, it makes me work a bit harder to thinking about, well, okay, how do I work with the characterization? How do I work within these limits to talk about the kinds of things I want to talk about? Do I need to work a bit harder at making sure the plot fits with the character, fits with the world building? And it generates creativity that I wouldn't have if I was just writing Alice in Wonderland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Lance, you are an environmental scientist. And so you bring that into your writing. You said you write about environmental collapse, and the end of the world. So how about everybody bringing real world knowledge, facts, science to bear on your futuristic storylines? And what kind of research do you need to do? How constricted do you feel by those boundaries versus free because you're going into the future and it's fiction? I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, I certainly agree with what Lance is saying about constraints and how constraints are kind of paradoxically freeing. When I used to teach creative writing, I found quickly that if I asked my students, go home and write a poem, nobody would be able to do that. If I told them, go home and write a poem using only one syllable words, they were all able to do it. All of a sudden, that constraint, it was like a fulcrum that they could use to actually begin to be creative. As for the constraints that I guess I work within, I wouldn't say that. I love reading about science and physics and things like that. My background is very different than that, though. I have a background in 16th century English non-dramatic literature. That's what my PhD is in. So there's not much science fiction from the early 16th century. But the constraint that I guess I find myself working with sometimes is the tradition of science fiction literature that goes back some time, and I find it interesting to try to insert myself into that both consciously and unconsciously, and I find that that act can be it's a constraint, but it can also be kind of liberating because, you're kind of sometimes standing on the shoulders of giants and sometimes you're pushing back against them.
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to jump in on piggyback on that as well. I think, so my background's in psychology. I have, most recently in a clinical psychology doctoral program, and I focus on behavior, of course, abnormal psychology, and all that. I also focus on wellness and positive psychology. So my goal with writing, I do pull in all those elements, and I think about the reader and how I can tap into their fears, tap into their emotions, tap into their exploration of things they may not be exploring in their real life, how I can get them to think about possibilities and move them forward. So when it comes to story, it's really about getting to the basics of, human motivation, emotion, and behavior, and what is going to get somebody to go on a journey. Like my main character goes on a journey. She's given, she's exploring this, and, she's got this conservative life by day and this exploration of aliens by night, and it's kind of, taboo for her, but she's got to be drawn and she's got to be pulled on this exploration and really come out of her shell. So for me, it's in my writing, and especially with science fiction, it's like getting that regular person that would never think about this stuff to pull open the book and like go on the journey with her and say, I'm afraid of this. Is this true? And think about it. I mean, when I was doing research for this, a lot of it was, of course, I have that background in clinical psychology, but I'm really looking at what documents are out there that I can look at and then, I can twist a little bit. But people will start thinking, is that real? Did that really happen? In 1960? Like, I went back, my book begins in 1960 and comes to the current day. So there's a lot of history in there too. And I think to pull upon where we have our education, where we have our life experience, that's our value as an author. We're inserting that into, yes, we're researching science fiction. Yes, we're creatively coming up with a story. Yes, we're wanting our reader to go on that ride with us throughout the journey. But really, it's who are we? How are we showing up to the book as the author? Where are we willing to go? And what knowledge and experience do we have that we can bring and we can use? So psychology is always the underpinning of every story I write, and I really want to get to the reader. And however I can do that, that's my goal. And that takes, not just work on the craft of writing itself, but also the research and making sure my characters are perfectly on point for what I'm trying to convey in my story.
Mm-hmm.
I love it. Kristina, whenever I encounter a psychology major, I always wonder, like, are you secretly in control of this whole meeting and we just don't know it?
No, we're clueless. No, I'm just
Did you make me say that right now?
Maybe I did. No, maybe the government did, Brad. I mean, that's really
that's
where
right.
I'm going with. No,
I'll get my little tin hat here. Awesome. So there we go. So my background, I have a little bit of a multiple personality background. I originally started off in the sciences. I started off as a medical science researcher with a biochemistry background, and I do find that does make its way into a lot of my stories. My first novel, Duatero, really pulled heavily on my biochemical background. I think there is like authentic science behind, the alien flora and fauna and what was happening in the world. That was kind of built into that I pulled on my background. Since then, I've joined the dark side, and I now teach business. I'm a business prof, weirdly enough. And my PhD was, and everybody's going to think that this isn't a real thing, but my PhD was in organizational wisdom. And now most people don't think you can actually use those two words together without irony, but that was my research. And I find like a lot of my novels now really explore, like, what does it mean to be wise? What does it mean to be wise? And, just sort of putting kind of characters in those situations where that's really, I don't know, it's something that they wrestle with, right? Making good choices versus bad, and sort of facing that tension. So there we go. Mm-hmm. So I pull up my research for that as well.
I love that. Very practical.
Yes. Yeah. I want to go back to something you said a little earlier, Brad, about when you're in science fiction, the readers come to it with less of their biases intact, right? The guard goes down a little bit because instead of just shining a spotlight on today's problems that has everybody stressed and frazzled, we're going into a different world, a different time and such. And Kristina, you mentioned too, getting the reader into your story. So talk more, everybody, about bringing the reader to your story and what's special about science fiction in regard to that meeting place.
Openness, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll take a start on this. Then other people can answer more eloquently after. I find so I know my opinion. I think what pulls, so a couple of things. What pulls readers into stories, especially in sci-fi, characters, little mysteries. Like I think character. For me, and I can acknowledge that there's probably a discussion and debate about how some sci-fi authors may not be the best character writers. But for me, when I'm picking up a story, I like characters that I find interesting, problems that I find compelling that they're facing. And if you can sort of build in, like the little mysteries that need to be solved, I think that always pulls me in. I think that pulls readers in. And I think sci-fi has an advantage. A lot of sci-fi has an advantage because if you're picking up a sci-fi book for the first time, or if you're entering a world for the first time, you have to learn about, like, the whole world is a mystery. Everything's a mystery. Like, what can this, the culture, the technology, everything's a mystery. And a large portion of, a reader reading a sci-fi book for the first time is like, let's figure out what this society is and how it works and how do these things fit together. So I think mysteries draw people in, and sci-fi, a lot of sci-fi has that baked in, because you pick up a story, you're like, I don't even know what this world is and what happens. Like what are you even capable of? And you sort of get to learn that as you go through, which I think a lot of people find interesting.
Yeah. Just a reader, I'm just going to jump in here because I feel like this is a good question that kind of piggybacks on that question. As a reader, when I pick up a sci-fi, I really am looking for like that big question, right?
Uh-huh.
Like something that, why is the world in this way? Or maybe like if you're talking about interplanetary science fiction, or, questions that ask very large, kind of sweeping and thematic questions, which I feel like you guys have all spoken to at some level. So in addition to that, sort of like what draws your readers in, like how do you guys weave in those big questions to kind of have that inspiration or have that pull, right?
And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's where I was going with what Brad was saying too, is that I want to connect with the regular person who's got this normal life and is questioning things, but doesn't maybe speak up or, really give it the thought that it needs. And I feel like in my stories, there's a duality in everyone, right? Like we're all, at least very three-dimensional, maybe more people, right? Hopefully more than that. But is this real? Is that true? Those are the questions I think about. And when I am talking about my books, I always say, question everything. Question everything. Is that possible? Is it true? Is it real? Is that a lie? Is where I am today normal? Like when they put a book down, one of my books down, I want them to say, like, is this where I'm living and what's going on in my life right now? Is this normal? Is this real? Is something else going on? What could be happening? Questioning things, thinking about life. It's not just about the story. The story is great, and I want them to pull in and enjoy it and be satisfied at the end. But I really want them to put the book down and go, let me think about my life. Let me think about life in general. And not to give them any feeling of being unstable in their world or like, not being able to connect with reality, but really more about questioning things, thinking about life differently, exploring the duality of life, not just accepting what is, and being able to dive into the unknown. And so those are the questions I explore in my books. And I'm sure many of us do in different ways as well as science fiction authors, but I really want that to be a life changer. I want people to put the book down and say, wow, could that be? Is that? Let me think about this more. And it gets you out of your comfort zone, and it gets you out of your little shell where you live and your the world that you've created for yourself that is, kind of you're boxed in. A lot of times we get used to our routines and our habits, and like, get out of that. Start thinking, start questioning. Like, it's exciting. It's scary, but it's exciting. And that's what I like about it, is that it is, even in researching my book, I was terrified with some of the things I was finding, like, is that real? Oh, I'm going to pretend it is, and for fiction's purpose. But I want my readers to go through that too. I want them to think a little bit more deeply about life.
Looking for expert support and a writing community? My Novel Journey coaching program is perfect for experienced novelists seeking mentorship and connection. Benefit from personalized guidance, detailed feedback, and a community that shares your passion for writing while getting the challenges writers face. Enhance your craft, achieve your writing goals, and confidently polish your novel. Join me now and take your writing to new heights. Go to wordessential.com/fiction coaching and schedule your free discovery call today.
Mm-hmm.
And
I agree with everything that everybody is saying. At the same time, though, I think we're talking about, the best science fiction. And there's lots of science fiction that is just, turn one page, then the next page, and so on. So I guess what I'm wondering is, I wonder if what we're saying is also true of other genres, though. Like I'm thinking of, let's say, Westerns or mysteries or noir, things like that. I think the best examples of all those genres can do the same thing. My favorite novel actually isn't a science fiction novel. It's Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, and I think it does the same kinds of things. It raises all kinds of questions about what it means to be and what is ethical. And it's an astonishing novel. So I guess I'm wondering to what extent other genres do have things in common with science fiction. And I guess I fall back sometimes to something that the Canadian literary critic Northrop Frye said. He said, there's one story and one story only, the loss and recovery of identity. And I think at heart, that's what all stories have in common. And around that, of course, we can raise other questions about ethics and philosophy and technology and ontology and epistemology and things like that. So I'm not disagreeing with what anyone's saying. I guess I'm just being prompted into thinking about how it might relate to other genres as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and I think too that, part of the answer to your question, Alida, is part of it is it's not different in science fiction. Part of what draws the reader in is a character that you care about, And if it's a short story, you've read something in the first 2 paragraphs or so that makes you care about that character at least a bit. And that applies to any genre. But science fiction, and I think maybe I'm just going to be paraphrasing some things that Kristina said, but I think science fiction with the world building, with the speculative premise, the what if that you're as a writer you're laying out there, that in the best science fiction, that's not just a setting. I think back to my high school English class. We learned, well, a story is made up of character, plot, theme, and setting. And in science fiction, the world building is not simply a setting. It's not simply a place where the story happens. In the best science fiction, I mean, in some of the lazy science fiction, it could be a Western, and they could have rifles instead of laser guns, and the story wouldn't be any different at all. But in the best science fiction, that world building is part of the story. The world that you create as a writer almost, in fact, becomes another character in the story. Mm-hmm. And it becomes then that caring as a reader, being drawn in because you care about the character, but then also having, as Brad was saying, these little mysteries. And this was I think a lesson that I learned along the way is, when I was in my early days of trying to write science fiction, when I came up with a really cool idea, a premise that I thought, okay, wow, this is what I've been aiming for, is having a mind-blowing premise like this, I would always try and make it like an idea story, where the whole story is about getting to the answer. There's a mystery, and I'm trying to solve it by the end. And so, what is this world? It's like, oh, okay, Charlton Heston is actually on Earth. It's the planet of the apes is Earth in the future. That's one way to write that story. But it's also fine to just have those little ideas and mysteries as you go along. And some of those mysteries you find out in the opening scene of, this world is like this, and this is the weird thing that happened. And that there's still things for the reader to learn is, okay, it's set 200 years in the future, and we've heard a bit about, and we've heard the main premise, and how is the character reacting to that? But there's still mysteries for the reader in the world building of, how did it get there? And part of what you're doing as a writer with the world building is, in a natural way, weaving it into the story of bits and pieces that describe how the world is, why it is the way it is, how it affects characters, that weaving that world building in there. And so those mysteries are coming all the way along, and you're asking the kinds of questions that Kristina was talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so much great wisdom has just been shared, and through this conversation with everything you're saying. And I do think, to go back to what Mark was saying about all genres of literature, I do think great literature has so much of this in common, regardless of the genre you're in. But with speculative fiction or science fiction more specifically, you've got that forward placement in time, so as the conversation has been going on, I was thinking, well, yes, but then we have that, reader bias sort of being lowered, as we mentioned earlier. And, well, why tell the story with laser guns instead of rifles on the plains or in the desert? Something about this writer's inspiration, something about the story that wants to come through is making it particular to a futuristic lens. And so then it's asking us and the readers, we the writers, and also the readers who come to the story, to say, what brought us here? What's happening now that could land us in this future place? And we've got a lot of kind of dystopian futures in the group here. Environmental collapse. We've got conspiracy theories. So bad government. So why those stories? Why not just, Star Trek, go off, find a new frontier, bring peace to some people or whatever, whatever the thing is. why these stories that you've all been drawn to write?
I mean, I tend not to write dystopias. But I mean, I try and, like, if I'm looking at sort of near future environmental issues, I try to be honest and, look at what's plausible. And but even if I write, something about it somehow deals with, collapse of governments or, breakdown of our civilization because of how much we've messed up the world we live on. Even if I'm writing a story like that, I'm very interested in exploring hope and what does hope look like in those circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And dystopian fiction can do that, but I'm also interested in how we avoid dystopias. And what would
Lance, give us and everyone listening the premise of your latest work or your favorite work. Illustrate what you're talking about for us, would you?
Okay. Well, the story of mine that's the opening story in my new collection, Chasing New Suns, is called 5 Days Until Sunset. The story won the Writers of the Future contest last year, and it's set in a far future, 14,000 years in the future. So it's a very different world. In mapping out what happened between here and there, I've got vague ideas, but not a whole lot of detail. So it's very disconnected from our current world. But in a sense, it's partly a metaphor for what we're doing in the world today with climate change and taking care of our world. So in this, the characters in the story are arriving as colonists they were in cryogenic sleep. They're waking up and arrive on a world which they thought was a tidally locked planet. One of these planets that the same faces the star as it goes around. So there's a permanent day and a permanent night. They were ready to live on that world because the little bit of fleeting information they were able to get from probes they sent ahead suggested that there is life on the planet and it's livable in the twilight, in the place where it's not right under the hottest point under the sun, and it's not on the frozen backside of the planet. They arrive on the planet, and within a day or so, they realize that the world, in fact, is not tidally locked. It's a planet that's in the process of tidally locking, but it's still very, very slowly rotating. And it's rotating slowly enough that it's like a tidally locked planet. Where it's noon, it's too hot to live. Where in the night side is completely frozen. So they have to stay in the twilight, but the world is turning, so they can't build anywhere. A day on this world is 15 years. So now they find, what are we going to do? They're faced with some inconvenient facts, and this is where the metaphor comes in of, we're faced with some inconvenient facts with our economic system is dealing with the natural world, and what are we going to do about it? They could have looked at that as, this is an apocalypse. This is a complete dystopia. This is the worst thing that could possibly happen to us. And most of them do look at it that way. And they have to decide, how are we going to respond? How are we going to live on this world where we can't even, if we build a house, we have to move out of the house in a few weeks because the sun is slowly setting.
Right. Wow.
And so the character questions, the moral questions, the social questions that I'm trying to explore in the story is, how do we as human beings find hope, make a decision when the world seems to have stacked the deck against us?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of food for thought stacked into that story. I can just imagine reading it and thinking about it for days. Brad, you said Duatero is an end of the world story.
Sort of,
right?
Yeah.
Sort of. Okay.
It is. It's the end of some people's world. Yeah. Yep. Did I interrupt you? You got.
No, I was just
Yeah.
going why an end of the world story? What attracted you to explore this issue?
Okay, yeah. So when I call it an end of the world story, so it's the premise of it is it's this far distant colony of Earths on this other planet, and it lost contact with Earth thousands of years ago for mysterious reasons. Just contact was lost and has never been regained, and so this colony is kind of left on its own, and it's petered along for centuries. But it's been under this slow decline. When they're in contact with Earth, there's all these great terraforming initiatives. They're growing and expanding. But as they lost that contact, the natural world has started to encroach in, and that's where the biochemistry comes in. It's not very compatible with human biology, right? So the world has been slowly starting to, it's been getting smaller and smaller. And lately something has been happening in the outside world, in the natural fauna, that's accelerated that. And their society's at a tipping point and is like, well, okay, let's try to figure out what's going on. And the reason why, what really got me thinking about that, and again, it comes back to that research on wisdom, organizational wisdom, which people don't think exists. When you think about wisdom, you don't need wisdom when you know what the right answer is. When the answer is clear, you don't need wisdom. You know how to make toast. You don't need wisdom to make toast. You just stick on the toaster, press the button. You need wisdom when you're dealing with complex situations where the answer is not clear, where you don't know what the right thing to do is. And I wanted to explore that. With Duatero, I wanted to explore the ways people respond to situations where they don't know what to do. Situations important, the stakes are high, and I don't know what to do. How do people respond to that situation, right? And you have some people that are like, oh, let's roll up our sleeves and just innovate our way out of this. We have other people that are like, let's just do what we've always done harder. What we've always done's work. Now is not the time to take risks. And then that tension, right? Those tension between all those different spectrums and approaches there. I wanted to explore that. How do people deal with high stakes situations where they don't know what's going on, why it's happening, or how to fix it, and just sort of deal with those dynamics. The reason why I wanted to explore that, say some of the Lance. We seem to be facing some of those things ourselves right now. If you are of the mind that climate change is real, that would be something that I think sort of falls into that category. And I think you see that in society today. You see different groups of people responding very strongly, different ways to these high stakes situations where we honestly, everybody thinks they have the answer, but honestly, if you took a step back, we probably don't have the answer. We need to figure it out. Mm-hmm. And I think you see those dynamics in play in society today. A lot of the tension that we have towards and animosity towards each other, I think, comes out of that. And I wanted to explore that. And so that's where Duatero comes from. And then, I can't remember, I think it might have been Lance's point. I can't remember who mentioned it, that, you create the world for the story. You create the technology that you need for the story, right? You don't necessarily fill up pages of your book on a technology that doesn't have any, relevance to the story and the theme, right? So the world that you create, the technology, the situation you create is really driven by the needs of the story, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so true. Mark, you have a strong literary background, and the Headmasters is dystopian YA. So why YA fiction? What attracted you to write for younger readers, for youth?
Well, it was more or less just sort of biographical. My wife and I adopted 4 older kids. And so we spent, 13, 14, 15 years raising them and reading them a lot of stories and things like that. And I don't know how many YA things I read. So after they got to an age where they could look after themselves more or less, I thought, well, I want to start writing again, because my writing just had to go on pause, as did my wife's for those years. Prior to adopting them, all my books had been nonfiction. And afterwards, I thought, well, I'm going to try to write a young adult novel. As for it being dystopian, post-apocalyptic, I mean, that's the the situation of the novel. But, it's like a phoenix rising. So there is a lot of hope that comes out in that novel. But having said that, I'm much more pessimistic now than I was even a few years ago. And, in all seriousness, I don't think we're going to be around in 50 years, 100 years. We're certainly not going to be around in 1,000 years. I'm sure. There's just too many things. That's one of my dogs. Too many things that are facing us. I think, the complex problems that we've been referring to. I've heard them recently called wicked problems, and I really like the idea of wisdom as being a kind of antidote for them. We need knowledge, we need data, but we also need that lore and that wisdom, I think, in order to try to get beyond things. But I don't know if we are, and if we do, if humans still exist 60 years from now, we're going to be existentially different than we ever have been. I think we're going to be, Ray Kurzweil talks about transhumanism, things like that. We'll merge with technologies. So I don't know. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But, all of you young folk, you can worry about that. I'll be long gone by then.
It's an interesting thing for sure. Definitely everything you're all writing and talking about, I think, gives us readers, listeners, society so much to stop and consider and to relate who we are today and the choices we're making today individually and collectively to what could become of us in the future. Kristina, I'm curious about aliens, right? So there's so much talk right now about disclosure and even people in the military coming forward and talking about UAPs, which is the new, acronym for what we used to call UFOs, et cetera. So, and you said that you want your readers to stop and ask, is this possible? Is what I'm living real and normal and such? So are aliens real?
Are they? I don't. So it's funny. We talked about themes that everyone here is exploring, and Lance talked about hope, and we talked about wisdom, and these different themes. And I feel like I explored truth and also trust. I think we are smarter than we've ever been, and we know less probably than we've ever known. There's so much information out there, but to dig through what's like accurate information and just junk, it's too much. So I feel like we question a lot of things now, and there's a lack of trust from many people in, the powers that are guiding us, our government. And so for me, writing this was really about what is truth? What is real? What do we know to be true? What do we know to be untrue? And even more so than that, like if, the government has some information or knows something and they're not sharing with us, is that for our protection? Is it for our control? Like what's really going on? So I like to explore those themes because I feel like we think about that stuff a lot in context of other areas. But when you think about extraterrestrial life or interplanetary communications, or are there, these beings here now? Have they always been? What's going on? I think all of this is possible. Do I know? Of course, I don't know. I think, it's all fiction, of course. But at the same time, I feel like, is it safe to know? So in my book, I explored that, really about, okay, my main character is on a quest. She is this conservative English professor who has this interest that's kind of taboo, and nobody wants to hear about it at this conservative university. And when she starts exploring it, and then happens to get information from her retired Army general neighbor, and they go down a path, and it gets leaked, and things start to spiral out of control. It was really about the knowledge itself. Is that knowledge? Is it helpful to have, or is it harmful to have? Should we know? I think about this a lot. Like, okay, if it was all real, if everything we heard was true, and, we were given the proof, like, do we want to know? are we okay with that? What will happen to the world? How will people react? So I explored that as well. Like when some things came to light in my book, how did people react? What did they do? What do I think would happen? Probably utter mayhem, is really what I think would happen. But that's my opinion. But, and I think about just those people in power, and I try to empathize with them and not just say, oh, it's all bad, bad, bad. It's like, I am in charge of this information that's so, can ruin lives, can really set us off course as a society. And do I share it? Do I hold it back? And for what reason? Is it for the good of everyone, or is it for my power? So I tried to explore all of that because I think those are real themes in it. And maybe it's related to, extraterrestrial life, but maybe it's related to other things, the things we've been talking about, climate change, environmental issues, all of this stuff. There's a lot of information that we have very little access to, and we don't know it all. And we think we do, but we don't. And so I kind of explore that. Anything is possible. And, what is safe to know? What is safe? What's better off not knowing, and how do I feel about it? And I have to tell you, I've changed my opinion a million times. I want to know everything. Tell me everything. And then it's like, oh, I don't want to know that. If that really is true, I don't want to know that. Like, I want to live in my ignorant bubble, and just be happy. So I go back and forth because, I have this critical thinking mind, and I'm a deep thinker, and I always have been. And I like to investigate things and explore things and keep my mind open to things. But those very things that I do that with are the things that terrify me. So that's kind of where I went in my book, and what made me want to write about it was like, let's go there. Let's talk about it. Let's explore it in fiction, in a safe place. But I want you to leave with little nuggets of what if, and think about it, because we don't know, right? So.
Wow. I love this. I love how thematic everybody is. I love that we're talking about all these different big questions. I have kind of I want to go back to what we were talking to Mark about YA. Mark, I'm going to put you on the spot. So my daughter is 6 and she's been reading audiobooks, and she's been really loving science fiction, adventure. They're younger, maybe skewed more middle grade than YA. But I've noticed that with her, maybe the theme more revolves around bravery and innovation, maybe that idea of that anything is possible. And so anything is possible, right? And so they solve problems differently and they act differently. She loves that wonder and that kind of different application of innovation and imagination. So is it similar in YA to that, where you're kind of just opening horizons? You know what I mean? To try and get kids to think differently or more innovatively or more outside of their normal boxes?
I would say so. I haven't really thought through that, but yeah, I guess what I want, if there's a sort of morality, I don't want to think about my, any fiction, any art in those terms, but if there is a morality behind my fiction or within my fiction, it's I guess ultimately about love. That's the only thing that can. I think that's even a more powerful, deeper, more profound part of human agency than hope, that everything is ultimately predicated on love. And I guess there's different ways of trying to convince young people that love is important, because there's so many things. I don't know how much love is there in social media, how much love is there on Twitter or X, things like that, especially now. And so I think it's important to try to reassure maybe young people that things like love are, without that, there's nothing. And I guess as well, we have an obligation to try to help each other. One of the things that one of my kids wrote once on a blackboard, I still have it up on one of our walls, and I'm most proud of, is she said, if you can't help 1,000 people, help one. And I think that's just so true. We all owe that to each other, and ultimately that's about love for each other. So that's what I would want to convey to young people, I think. Yeah.
Powerful.
I need to ask Mark a question.
That is.
I need to ask Mark a question. How can someone believe what you just said and think we're not going to be around in 60 years?
That is a great question.
The quick
So,
answer.
okay, quick answer.
The quick answer is, I honestly don't know if it's a bad thing if humans cease to exist. Something else. Earth's not going to vanish. The Earth will persist. The Earth will abide. The dude will abide, and maybe something else. But who knows? We've got ourselves out of messes before, and hopefully we'll do it again.
Well, spoken like a true optimist. Right.
A reluctant optimist, maybe.
Yes. Yes. So we are going to wrap up with the speed round question. So what classic or great, doesn't have to be a classic, but what great piece of science fiction has inspired you that you would like to recommend to each other and to our listeners? So everyone's had 5 seconds to think.
Well, I'll jump in again.
Great, Mark.
I'm going to mention, it's not even a work of literature. It's on Netflix or Prime right now. It's The Last of Us, which I think is just such an astonishing, beautiful series. In fact, it's so beautiful that after I watched the 3rd episode, I had to stop for a while because I just could not. I was afraid that it would not sustain itself. I would recommend that so much to anybody.
Wonderful. All right, Lance.
John Brunner, The Sheep Look Up. John Brunner's near future gritty science fiction was just so prescient, and most of his stuff I read in maybe the late 80s or in the 90s, and he was writing in the late 60s and early 70s, and the way he described the environmental mess we're making, the way he described the internet. He described so many things that were just so prescient and woven in interesting, exciting stories.
Thank you. Kristina, what's your recommendation for us?
So, I mean, this is an oldie, but I love anything by Robert Heinlein. I mean, I just he drew me in from day one, and I've read mostly all of his books. But a cult classic, and this is TV, and it's like my favorite. And when I would write, I always had it on in the background on Netflix, was Twilight Zone from the 1960s, because I love my short stories, and I love those shows are quick, they're twisty, they're clever. I mean, some are kind of cheesy, and it's fine, but I loved the quick thinking of the writers and Rod Serling, of course, and just my favorite. I always will be my favorite, The Twilight Zone, the original.
Great pick. Brad, how about you?
I'm glad I go last, so I had a lot of time to think about all my good answers. But honestly, I'd recommend, and maybe you've all probably read her already, but Ursula Le Guin. I'm sorry, I've mispronounced her name at least once there. I think she does a wonderful job of just really exploring issues in a neutral way. She doesn't come across preachy with this is the right way to do it, but she explores some really complex issues in a really, I think, thoughtful way. Left Hand of Darkness. So my favorites, Left Hand of Darkness or The Dispossessed. Those are probably the top two I'd recommend.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us at the Storyworks Roundtable today. This has been a ton of fun. You are all more than welcome to come back and chat with us again, together or singly. This was great. So for the listeners, we will have everybody's headshot and book cover and link in the show notes at storyworkspodcast.com. So just go there, one place, find everybody, track them on social media, buy their books. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
My newsletter, A Room Full of Books and Pencils, is growing every week with new reflections, writing tips, and transcripts of the podcast. It's also where I make announcements about things like upcoming writing workshops and coaching sessions. Check out A Room Full of Books and Pencils at booksandpencils.substack.com. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.